Ananya Patel was just 23, a bright Indian student chasing the American dream in Los Angeles until a secret sugar daddy relationship with a powerful older man ended in a brutal and unexpected death that stunned both her university and her family thousands of miles away. Ananya Patel stepped off the plane at LAX with her heart full of hope and her head full of dreams. At 23, she had left behind a modest life in Mumbai, armed with a scholarship and the unwavering belief that America would offer her everything she had worked so hard for. Her parents had sacrificed to send her abroad, and she was determined to make every opportunity count. She enrolled in a well-known university in Los Angeles, majoring in data science, and moved into a shared apartment near campus with two other international students. Her days quickly fell into a steady rhythm: classes, part-time work at the campus library, and long nights studying. She smiled in every video call home, always telling her parents she was managing just fine. But Los Angeles was expensive. Her scholarship covered tuition, but rent, textbooks, groceries, and daily expenses piled up fast. The library job barely paid minimum wage, and international student restrictions made it difficult to find better-paying work. She started skipping meals, using public Wi-Fi to avoid internet bills, and sharing textbooks with classmates to cut costs. She kept these struggles to herself, not wanting to worry her family. The stress built slowly, quietly, pressing down on her each day. She needed another source of income, something fast and flexible, something that wouldn't interfere with her studies. Late one night, as she scrolled through forums for international students, she found threads discussing sugar dating. The posts described how young women met wealthy older men willing to pay for companionship, gifts, and sometimes more. It sounded risky, but the way people talked about it made it seem common in cities like Los Angeles. She spent the next few days reading, researching, hesitating. Then, out of desperation, she created a profile using a fake name and a carefully chosen photo that didn't reveal her identity. Within hours, messages began pouring in. Most were crude or demanding, but one stood out. After 2 weeks of back-and-forth messaging, Rick suggested they meet in public dinner at an upscale restaurant. He assured her there were no expectations. She agreed, convincing herself she would walk away if anything felt wrong. She wore a modest dress, kept her phone fully charged, and sent her location to a friend before arriving. Rick greeted her at the valet stand. He was older, yes, but well-dressed and soft-spoken. He didn't touch her, didn't stare, just led her inside and asked about her studies. She relaxed as the evening went on. He listened, laughed at her stories, and seemed genuinely interested in her goals. At the end of the night, he handed her an envelope with 500, saying it was just for spending time with him. Ananya took it reluctantly, telling herself it was a one-time thing, but a few days later, he texted her again. Another dinner, more cash. She said yes. What started as a cautious arrangement slowly became part of her routine. Rick began covering her rent and helping with tuition. She justified it all by telling herself there was no physical relationship, just dinners, conversation, and the occasional night watching movies in his home. The financial relief was immediate. She stopped worrying about food. She could finally buy her own textbooks. She even began sending money back home, saying it was from a merit-based award. But the comfort came with strings. Rick started calling more often. He asked personal questions, grew irritated if she took too long to reply. When she mentioned going out with friends, he would sulk or suggest she was seeing someone else. He claimed it was just concern, but the tone of his messages shifted. He began using phrases like "you're mine" and "I don't want to share you." Ananya felt uneasy but tried to calm him, afraid to lose the financial help. Then he showed up near campus one evening, waiting outside her building. He said it was a surprise, but she hadn't told him where she lived. She laughed it off, but her heart sank. Her roommates, Priya and Leah, began to notice changes. Ananya was secretive, jumpy, and often distracted. She avoided questions, always said she was just tired. One night, Leah saw her stepping into a black luxury car at the end of the street. Ananya later claimed it was an Uber to a study session, but Leah didn't believe her. The following week, Rick came to her apartment again, this time uninvited. He brought flowers and asked to talk. Ananya refused to let him inside, whispering through the barely cracked door. Priya heard the entire exchange and confronted her after he left. Ananya finally admitted she was in a sugar arrangement, but insisted she was safe and in control. Still, she began to consider ending things. Rick's behavior felt too intense. She feared he might do something rash if she pulled away too fast. She started withdrawing slowly, taking longer to reply, turning down invitations. When Rick asked why, she claimed she was busy with exams, but he didn't believe her. He sent increasingly desperate texts, and once, a message that simply read, "Don't disappear on me." Ananya drafted a message to him one evening, saying she needed space and couldn't continue the arrangement. She didn't send it. She went to bed thinking she'd wait a day or two, find the right moment. But the next morning, she was gone. She missed class, then another. Her roommates tried calling, but her phone was off. They waited, hoping she'd show up late. But by nightfall, panic set in. Her laptop was still on her desk. Her keys and ID were gone, but her favorite jacket hung by the door. No message, no clue. It was like she had vanished into thin air, and no one knew where to begin looking. The initial panic over Ananya's absence started small. Her roommates assumed she had gone to stay with a friend or had simply forgotten to update them. But by the end of the second day, that calm began to fray. Priya knocked on her bedroom door again and again, hoping to hear the sound of movement inside. Nothing. Leah checked the Find My iPhone app, but it showed her phone was offline. Calls went straight to voicemail. Messages weren't delivered. She hadn't logged into the university portal or responded to any group project emails. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. They reported her missing to campus security, who initially treated it as a case of a stressed student needing space. But Priya insisted this wasn't like Ananya. She never disappeared without warning. She never missed class. The police were finally contacted on the third day, and a missing person report was filed with the LAPD. Officers visited the apartment, questioned the roommates, and examined Ananya's bedroom. Nothing was out of place. Her books were neatly stacked, her planner open to the current week. Her laptop browser had tabs still open, one for a homework assignment, another for a food delivery service. It was like she had just stepped out and never come back. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. The building's security footage was pulled, but the camera angle near the front door was too low quality to make out details. Investigators checked her bank records. The last transaction was 4 days prior, a small purchase at a convenience store. Her phone had last pinged a tower near West Hollywood the night she vanished. Then it went silent. Detectives began piecing together her contacts and schedule. Her professors were interviewed. Her classmates offered little. Most described her as quiet, focused, and polite. Some had worked with her on group projects. None knew of any enemies or drama in her life. Her work supervisor at the library said she had called in sick the day she disappeared. She had sounded tired, but nothing seemed unusual. Then came the breakthrough. One of the detectives noticed a draft email in her university inbox. It was addressed to someone named Richard G., but never sent. The subject line read, "I need to say this." The body of the message was short, but revealing. It said she felt unsafe, that the relationship wasn't working anymore, and that she was stepping away. The draft ended mid-sentence. Richard G. wasn't listed as a contact, but police traced the email through her cloud backups and recovered a phone number. It belonged to a man named Richard Grant, a 54-year-old financial consultant who lived in a large property nestled deep in the Hollywood Hills. A quick background check showed no criminal history. He was divorced, no children, and kept a low profile. But his name wasn't unfamiliar to the detective in charge. Richard had been mentioned in 2 prior complaints over the past 5 years, both filed by much younger women who described him as controlling and aggressive after short romantic relationships. Neither complaint resulted in charges. Both women had eventually stopped cooperating with authorities. Detectives decided to pay him a visit. The house was large, modern, and eerily quiet. Richard opened the door himself. He looked surprised but calm. He acknowledged knowing Ananya and admitted they had a private arrangement. He claimed she was an adult who made her own decisions and said she had come over a week earlier, stayed the night, and left the next morning in a rideshare. When asked why she hadn't been seen since, he shrugged and suggested she might have run away with someone else. Something felt off. Officers noted inconsistencies in his story. He was vague about when exactly she had arrived, couldn't confirm the time she left, and offered no proof of the rideshare claim. When asked about his home security footage, he said his outdoor cameras had been broken for months. The indoor system, he claimed, wasn't active. Detectives requested access to search the home. He refused. They returned with a warrant 2 days later. The search uncovered small but troubling clues. In a corner of the garage, officers found a duffel bag containing some of Ananya's clothes, along with a broken phone charger and a handwritten note in her native Hindi. In the guest house closet, hidden beneath old storage boxes, they found her university ID. The home's security system had several missing hours of footage around the time of her disappearance. More pressing was the discovery of a small burn pile in the backyard, partially covered by stones and soil. It appeared to be recently disturbed. Forensic teams collected samples. Charred fabric, fragments of plastic, and what looked like human hair were bagged and sent for testing. A cadaver dog reacted strongly at the edge of the pool area, near a retaining wall. A second dog confirmed the scent of human remains. Richard was brought in for questioning. Under pressure, he remained composed but evasive. He insisted she had been alive when she left. He claimed she was depressed and suggested she might have harmed herself elsewhere, but the evidence was mounting against him. Investigators reviewed his phone records and discovered encrypted messaging apps. With a warrant, they accessed his backup cloud and located archived chats with Ananya. The messages painted a disturbing timeline. Ananya had tried to end the relationship. She repeatedly asked for space, said she wanted to focus on school, and even hinted that she felt unsafe. His replies grew angry and erratic. He accused her of using him, threatened to expose her arrangement to the university, and wrote messages suggesting she owed him. One message, sent the night she vanished, simply said, "You're not walking away. You're mine." By the time the DNA results from the burn pile returned, the case was clear. The remains found contained a partial genetic match to Ananya Patel. It wasn't enough for a full identification yet, but combined with her ID, clothing, and the digital evidence, it formed a damning picture. Richard Grant was arrested for suspicion of second-degree murder and held without bail. News of the arrest spread quickly. The university released a statement expressing grief and pledging support to international students. Social media exploded with posts about Ananya. Her classmates mourned the quiet girl they had barely known. Her family in India was notified by the consulate. Her mother collapsed upon hearing the news. Her father begged officials for answers. The world now knew Ananya Patel's name, but the nightmare was only beginning. As Richard Grant sat behind bars, the LAPD worked to solidify the case against him. Prosecutors needed more than suspicion and circumstantial evidence, they needed undeniable proof. Forensics became the focus. The burned fragments collected from the backyard were carefully examined in a lab. Among the ashes, investigators found melted traces of dental fillings and a singed piece of cloth that matched a top Ananya had worn in a social media photo days before she disappeared. The most critical discovery, however, came in the form of a single intact bone fragment. It was from a human hand. DNA tests were rushed and confirmed the worst. The remains belonged to Ananya Patel. Once the confirmation came in, the charge against Richard was upgraded from suspicion to second-degree murder. The press descended on the story. Headlines screamed of a wealthy older man and a vulnerable international student caught in a hidden relationship gone wrong. The media branded it a tale of exploitation, obsession, and betrayal. But behind the sensational coverage was a brutal truth. A young woman trying to survive in an unfamiliar country had lost her life in a desperate attempt to escape a relationship she no longer wanted. With a confirmed victim and a prime suspect in custody, detectives turned to Ananya's digital history to map the timeline of her final days. Her cloud backups revealed not just her conversations with Richard but also drafts of journal entries she had written but never shared. One file, created just 3 days before her death, expressed her fears plainly. She wrote that she felt suffocated, that Richard had grown unpredictable, and that she was afraid of what he might do if she left him. The tone was not dramatic, it was practical, thoughtful, and clear. She had even written that she planned to move out of her apartment to distance herself from him. Detectives cross-referenced these entries with Richard's own communications. They uncovered deleted emails in which he expressed jealousy about her friends, suspicion about her professors, and confusion about why she had become distant. While he never directly threatened her in writing, his messages were filled with possessive language. In one, he wrote that he had never invested so much in someone who turned so cold. In another, he said, "It's not over unless I say it is." Police also looked at his online behavior. Richard had been active on multiple sugar dating websites under various usernames. He had contacted dozens of young women, all in their early 20s, offering financial support in exchange for companionship. While most conversations went nowhere, a few hinted at a pattern. He lured women in with charm and money, but quickly turned demanding. One woman had exchanged a few messages with him before blocking him entirely after he insisted she delete her social media. With subpoenas issued, more evidence flooded in. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station captured Ananya's distinct red backpack in the passenger seat of Richard's car on the night she disappeared. Her phone, though switched off after that evening, had briefly connected to Wi-Fi in Richard's home hours before it was deactivated. He had claimed she left the property that night. The data said otherwise. Investigators also examined Richard's financial records. In the months he had been seeing Ananya, he had sent regular wire transfers to a second bank account she had created. These payments matched the dates of their meetings. But what caught investigators' attention was a final transfer, one that occurred a full day after she vanished. It was for a much higher amount than usual. It raised questions. Why would he send her money after she was gone? Was it to make it appear that she had willingly disappeared, or a final attempt to cover up what he had done? The prosecution began building their narrative. Richard Grant, a man of wealth and influence, had developed an emotional fixation on a student nearly 30 years younger. When she attempted to end the relationship, he reacted not with acceptance, but with violence. They theorized that he had lured her to his home under the pretense of talking things out. Something happened, an argument, a confrontation, and he lost control. The physical evidence supported a struggle. Minor traces of blood were found in the guesthouse carpet. An area near the kitchen sink had been scrubbed with bleach. At the same time, the defense began crafting their counterargument. They claimed that Ananya was emotionally unstable, overwhelmed by school pressures and the secrecy of her lifestyle. They suggested that she had willingly visited Richard, perhaps in a distressed state, and that her death had been an accident. The defense tried to steer the narrative toward confusion and tragedy, not cold-blooded murder. But their argument weakened when prosecutors discovered one more piece of evidence: Richard's home security backup drive, which he had told officers was non-functional. Technicians recovered several corrupted files, but one video survived. It showed Ananya entering the house through the front gate on the night she disappeared. There was no footage of her leaving. The trial date was set. In the courtroom, Ananya's family sat in silence, flown in by a victim support fund. Her mother clutched a framed photo of her daughter from graduation. Her father stared straight ahead, expressionless. They didn't understand every word spoken, but they didn't need to. The weight of their loss filled the room. The prosecution laid out its case in clean, careful steps. The sugar dating relationship, the possessive behavior, the sudden disappearance, the matching bone DNA, the security footage, the messages, the body burned in the backyard. Each piece fit. Each detail built the picture. The defense tried to humanize Richard, portraying him as lonely, misled, and emotionally entangled. They argued that Ananya had accepted his support and then abandoned him, causing emotional distress. But they couldn't explain the physical evidence. They couldn't deny the video. They couldn't erase the forensic match. The jury watched, listened, and absorbed every moment. When it came time to deliberate, they took only 6 hours. Richard Grant was found guilty of second-degree murder. As the verdict was read, Ananya's mother broke into tears. Her father remained still, eyes closed. Richard showed no emotion. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. For many, the case was over. But for Ananya's family, it had only cemented a deeper grief: the knowledge that their daughter had been suffering in silence, and no one had known until it was far too late. After the trial concluded and Richard Grant was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom emptied slowly. Ananya's parents remained seated for several long minutes. The gavel had fallen, the sentence was handed down, and the man responsible for their daughter's death would spend decades behind bars. Yet there was no relief, only silence. Her father clutched the armrest of his chair with trembling fingers, while her mother stared blankly at the floor, the framed graduation photo still pressed against her chest. The justice system had spoken, but it could not return what they had lost. Their daughter was still gone, and all that remained was the brutal knowledge of how she had died. Outside the courthouse, news cameras rolled, crowds gathered, and microphones were pushed forward, but Ananya's family declined every interview. They had flown thousands of miles from Mumbai to witness the man who destroyed their world stand trial. Now they just wanted to return to a home that felt emptier than ever before. In India, relatives and neighbors had followed the story with horror and disbelief. In Mumbai's local news, headlines bore her name in bold fonts. A young woman with promise, taken far too soon. Back in Los Angeles, the case stirred waves across the city. The university that Ananya had attended released a longer statement in the days following the verdict, expressing deep sorrow and a renewed commitment to student safety. But for many students, especially those far from home, their fears were already rooted too deep. Ananya's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. Students whispered about it in dormitories, in libraries, in classrooms. Some admitted to having secret jobs, quiet arrangements, side hustles kept hidden from advisors and parents. Suddenly, Ananya's story wasn't rare. It was disturbingly familiar. Campus support groups saw an influx of international students seeking counseling. More students began attending financial literacy seminars. Anonymous surveys circulated, collecting stories of students who had turned to unconventional ways of surviving the cost of Los Angeles life. Sugar dating wasn't new, but Ananya's story had given it a face, one with a soft voice, sharp mind, and vulnerable silence. Her name became a quiet symbol among those who felt alone in a city that never slowed down for anyone. Meanwhile, investigators continued to dig into Richard Grant's past, even after the conviction. It became clear that Ananya wasn't his first target. More women came forward, former sugar partners, casual acquaintances, and online matches. They described similar behavior. He was generous at first, polite, and reserved. But as time passed, he became possessive and controlling. One woman claimed he had once followed her home. Another said he had tracked her social media activity and sent angry messages when she didn't respond quickly. All had cut ties before things escalated. Ananya, for reasons no one could fully understand, hadn't managed to escape in time. The court case also reopened conversations about the digital platforms that facilitated such arrangements. Critics argued that sugar dating websites were thinly veiled marketplaces for exploitation. Defenders insisted that the platforms simply connected consenting adults. But now, with Ananya's death making headlines across the world, the conversation had shifted. She hadn't been coerced by a website. She had been cornered by someone who masked obsession as affection, who used money to control, and who turned violent when control slipped away. As media interest grew, several documentary channels began producing content on the case. YouTube was flooded with breakdowns of the timeline, Reddit filled with theories and armchair analyses. Some tried to blame Ananya for putting herself in a dangerous situation. Others defended her fiercely, pointing to the financial struggles so many students faced. But in the middle of all the noise, one truth remained constant: Ananya Patel had not deserved to die. Months later, a candlelight vigil was held at the university in her memory. A quiet crowd gathered outside the main library, the same one where she had worked long hours behind the front desk. Her former professors attended, as did many students who hadn't known her personally but were moved by her story. Candles flickered in the night air. A photo board displayed snapshots from her time at school, smiling during orientation, standing beside classmates at a science fair, reading in the library corner. Her name was spoken softly, over and over, as students placed notes and flowers beneath the photo wall. One student stepped forward to speak, her voice steady but low. She told the crowd that Ananya had once lent her a textbook without hesitation. Another recalled late-night study sessions where Ananya explained complex coding concepts patiently and kindly. Small memories surfaced from those who had barely known her but now felt tied to her by grief. Ananya was no longer just a news story. She was real, a presence once among them, now forever gone. In India, her parents held a small private ceremony. They lit incense, placed her framed photo among marigolds, and prayed in silence. Her room remained untouched. Her books were still stacked neatly on the desk. The acceptance letter from her university still hung above her bed. They had planned to visit Los Angeles one day to attend her graduation, to see her walk across the stage in cap and gown. Now, all they had were photos, memories, and a courtroom verdict that could never fill the hole she left behind. Richard Grant began serving his sentence at a state correctional facility. Despite the overwhelming evidence and public condemnation, he never confessed. In his official statement during sentencing, he said nothing. He didn't look at Ananya's parents. He didn't show remorse. The silence he left behind felt cruel and deliberate. Though justice had been served by legal standards, the emotional weight lingered. People continued to ask how a young woman with so much promise had ended up in such a dark corner of life. There were no simple answers. There never had been. What remained was the uncomfortable truth that vulnerability, silence, and desperation often walk side by side. And in Ananya's case, they had walked her straight into danger. The university eventually established a small scholarship in her name. It was meant to support international students from low-income families, offering financial assistance and counseling resources. It couldn't change the past, but it was a start, a promise that her story would not be forgotten, that others in her situation would have more than silence to fall back on. Ananya's photo stayed pinned to a campus bulletin board long after the trial. Most walked by without noticing, but some stopped, looked, and remembered. A face once hidden behind layers of secrecy was now immortalized in truth. Her story remained not in the words spoken at the trial, or the headlines that came and went, but in the quiet legacy she left behind, whispered between those who lived with the same fears, the same needs, and now, a reason to speak out. Nearly a year after Ananya Patel's death, her name still lingered like a shadow across Los Angeles. Though the trial had ended and her killer was locked away, the memory of her final days left a mark that would not fade. Her photo was no longer front-page news, but it remained etched in online articles, campus tributes, and the minds of those who had followed her story from beginning to end. In quiet corners of the internet, her name lived on, passed between strangers who shared her story with warnings, sorrow, and disbelief. At her university, new students arrived each semester, unaware of the tragedy that had once unfolded just blocks from campus. But for returning students, Ananya's story remained close. A new policy had been introduced that required faculty to attend training on student financial stress and off-campus risk behavior. Anonymous reporting channels were promoted more widely. Flyers offering counseling, support, and emergency aid appeared on bulletin boards where none had existed before. A quiet change had begun, subtle, but real. Ananya's former roommates, Priya and Leah, still lived in the same apartment, but the energy inside had changed. The room Ananya once occupied had remained empty for months. No one wanted to move into it. Eventually, the university intervened and arranged a replacement, but the presence of what had happened lingered in the walls. Priya confessed to a counselor that she still heard the sound of Ananya's voice in her head, sometimes her laughter, the way she softly hummed while studying, the faint sighs of frustration when assignments piled up. Leah started attending group therapy, where she met other students who had faced hidden traumas of their own. They talked about fear, pressure, and the isolation of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Across the city, in a correctional facility built far from the hills where Richard Grant once lived, life was very different. Richard's reputation inside prison was marked by notoriety. Inmates knew the case. Some had watched it on the news. His wealth and former status meant little now. He spent most of his days in silence, reading or pacing his small cell. Despite numerous appeals filed by his lawyers, no new evidence had emerged, no grounds for reconsideration. He had not spoken about Ananya. He refused interviews. His silence only fueled the public's lingering hatred. In India, her parents tried to carry on with their lives, but it was never the same. Ananya's mother rarely left the house. Her father returned to work briefly but retired early, unable to maintain focus. They created a small memorial space in their home, filled with framed photos, candles, and the scarf Ananya had left behind during her last visit. Her mother would sometimes sit beside the display in the evenings, speaking softly into the air as if her daughter were still listening. They had once dreamed of watching her succeed in America, earn a master's degree, maybe one day start a family of her own. That dream had become a nightmare they were still trying to wake from. Despite the grief, they decided to take one step forward. Using a portion of the legal settlement they received after the trial, they partnered with an NGO that helped international students facing financial hardship. The organization offered housing aid, travel stipends, and legal advice for those trapped in unsafe arrangements. They named the fund the Ananya Initiative. It started small, with just a few volunteers, but word spread, and students from cities like Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco reached out. Stories surfaced, students with similar experiences, hidden relationships, or near escapes. They weren't rare cases. They were simply hidden, like Ananya had been. The initiative began to make waves. Universities started hosting workshops. Podcasts invited guest speakers to talk about the blurred line between consent and control. News outlets ran follow-ups, exploring how common sugar dating had become for international students navigating life in expensive cities. Ananya's name returned to headlines not as a victim this time, but as the force behind a growing movement. But with awareness came backlash. Critics accused the movement of moral policing or of shaming consensual adult relationships. Some said Ananya had made her choices and paid the price. These opinions ignited fierce debates online. But those who knew the truth, her roommates, her professors, the investigators who had seen the photos of her remains, never questioned what had happened. It wasn't a case of bad decisions. It was a story of power, silence, and the slow erosion of safety in a life filled with pressure. Back at the university, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a small group of students held a silent walk across campus. They passed the library where she had worked, the courtyard where she once studied, and ended near the dorms where freshmen gathered, unaware of what the walk meant. Some students carried candles, others held signs bearing a single word: remember. They didn't speak. They didn't shout. They simply walked in silence, the way Ananya had once walked those same paths alone, burdened by secrets she couldn't share. By nightfall, candles lit the stone steps outside the library entrance. A few students stood quietly, staring at the flickering lights. Leah stepped forward and placed a handwritten note beside the photos. It read, "You were more than your silence." For many, the memory of Ananya Patel would fade with time. New stories would come, new tragedies would take their place. But for those who had seen what she endured, for those who still walked the halls she once did, her story would remain a whisper beneath the noise, a reminder of what can happen when desperation meets secrecy, and when one person's control turns into another's prison. She had come to America chasing opportunity, armed with intellect, determination, and hope. But the cost of survival had led her down a road she hadn't expected, one that ended far too soon. Now, her story stood as a cautionary tale, not of prejudgment, but of the silent struggles that many endure and the deadly consequences of unchecked power. Ananya Patel never wanted to be remembered this way, but in death, she became more than a headline. She became a name that moved people to action, a symbol for those who felt unseen, and a light for others walking the same narrow path she once had alone, but not forgotten.